All right, guys. Tonight's set of notes is entitled "Social Changes in a Young Nation." So we're taking a look at the way America's society has changed in the early years of the 1800s. Taking a look at the things that motivated reformers to try and push for changes in American society. And you can see this picture here is a drawing that encapsulates one of the main motivators for social change in the early 1800s, and that is the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening was a religious revival movement that swept the country in the early 1800s. We briefly talked about the First Great Awakening that occurred early on in colonial history, a religious revival movement. This is similar. There's lots of religious gatherings, revivals that are taking place all over the countryside, all over the country, where ministers are traveling, holding these large gatherings where they're talking about a revival of Christian faith. And this is going to inspire a lot of people in the U.S. to try and seek changes to American society, to try and reform it, to address the problems that they saw in society. So there are a lot of reform movements taking place during this time period. One is a reform in prisons. That one's really spearheaded by Dorothea Dix. She visited prisons and noticed that a lot of the people who were imprisoned weren't typical criminals. They were women, single mothers, young children with their single mothers, or mentally ill people who just have been caught up in these prisons, even though they weren't necessarily a typical criminal. And she looked to reform laws so that there would be places for these people to go that weren't necessarily prisons. So something like asylums begin to spring up for the mentally ill, houses for single women or single mothers and their children. Another reform movement that takes place during this time period is education reform. And this is spearheaded by a man named Horace Mann, and that's his picture over there to the right. Horace Mann really pioneered the idea of public education in the United States. Very few people received a formal education in the United States before the 1800s. And those who did tend to come from really wealthy families who could afford private tutors and then send their kids on to college eventually. Horace Mann pushed for states, especially, to pay for common schools. Schools where everyone could send their children, and these schools, or their children would receive a basic education: reading, writing, arithmetic. So not necessarily going to advanced education, but just making sure that everyone in the United States had at least a basic level of education. And these common schools will take off and kind of form the basis of what we know as public schools in the United States today. Another big reform movement during this time period was the temperance movement. The temperance movement is for an end to alcohol, right? Alcohol abuse. Especially women advocated for temperance, laws that limited the ability to consume alcohol because they saw alcohol as kind of the root of a lot of society's problems. These are some of the reform movements. The two that we're going to spend the most time on, though, are abolition and women's rights. So let's start with abolition. So abolition, or the end to slavery, was spearheaded by abolitionists who were trying to do what they can to bring about an end to slavery. And there's a lot of important figures associated with the abolitionist movement, and a lot of them kind of overlap between these movements also. A lot of reformers who are pushing for temperance are also pushing for abolition and for women's rights. So there's a lot of overlap between these reformers. But some of the important ones, Frederick Douglass was a gifted orator or speaker who traveled the country, and as a former slave himself, he spoke about the evils of slavery firsthand and was really able to expose the evils of slavery to a new population who wouldn't necessarily have been exposed to it. So people living in the cities in New York who don't see slavery, don't see slaves, now can hear firsthand from a former slave exactly what slavery was like or is like at the time. William Lloyd Garrison was an abolitionist who tried to push the abolitionist cause through a newspaper. He published The Liberator, which was a newspaper that called for abolition and for racial equality. And this newspaper was published and distributed all over the North in the United States. There are a lot of other important figures associated with the abolitionist cause that we necessarily or don't necessarily have time to get into, but hopefully we'll touch People like Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, amongst others, are going to be pushing this abolitionist cause. The other cause I want to spend a little bit of time on is women's rights. At the time, it's important to understand that women were still denied many of the basic rights that men had, including the ability to vote. We know male suffrage for white men was pretty much universal at this time. There were no property requirements. But for women, voting was denied. And oftentimes, women weren't even able to own property. Women were expected to stay in their homes and to raise families, raise children. But we begin to see a push for women's rights during this time period. There's a very important gathering, the Seneca Falls Convention, that occurred in 1848, when a lot of these important figures, important reformers, all appeared to speak out on behalf of women's rights, really pushing for women's suffrage, the right of women to vote. So you can see on the right, that is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's delivering one of the main documents that comes out of the Seneca Falls Convention. And Susan B. Anthony were also leaders in this movement. Frederick Douglass himself actually made an appearance at the Seneca Falls Convention. However, there is this push for women's rights, but women's suffrage is still denied to women after this time period. There are some gains made in women's rights during the early 1800s. In certain places, women earn the right to divorce. They earn the right to own property. But really, it's a slow process for women to gain rights. And we won't see women's suffrage for over another 100 years